Bridget Bishop was what some have called a singular character not easily described. She was a woman who was unapologetically herself in a time where women were not supposed to conduct themselves as such. Unfortunately for Bridget, she had decided to immigrate and call Salem, Massachusetts her home. Due to the way she carried herself and accusations made against her, Bridget would find herself in trouble with the law on numerous occasions. However, Bridget would ultimately meet her fate in 1692. This is the life and death of Bridget Bishop, the first person to be executed during the Salem witch trials. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am bringing you the second installment of my Spooktober series for this year, 2022. And so of course, just as a disclaimer, this video is for entertainment purposes only. My opinions will be sprinkled in, and all of this was based on the research that I was able to do from online sources. I will leave all of my sources linked in the description box below, but I do encourage everyone to do their own research as well. So I decided to look into Bridget Bishop after I was on Netflix the one night and was rewatching Sabrina because I loved Sabrina. I thought it was great. I love the original Sabrina and I love the one that was on Netflix. But I started watching it and just thinking about how something like that, like a show like that, is accepted in today's society. But back in the Salem witch trial era, and even after that, it would not have been something that was accepted. So I started thinking about the Salem witch trials and kind of looking into it, reading about it a little bit more, because most of us have probably learned about the Salem witch trials, but I had to just refresh my memory. So I came across someone named Bridget Bishop. And Bridget was the first person to be executed in the Salem witch trials. She was not the first person to be accused of witchcraft, but she was the first one to be executed. So I decided that I wanted to kind of look into her life, what caused her to be accused of this and eventually executed for it. And let me just tell you, it was some of the things that I found in my research were just mind-blowing. Being a woman in today's society, just absolutely mind-blowing. But without further ado, let's get into the video. Bridget Bishop was born between the years 1632 and 1637 as Bridget Magnus in Norwich, England. However, Bridget, her sister Mercy, her father John, and her mother Rebecca adopted the last name Playfair, which was Bridget's paternal grandmother's maiden name. I haven't been able to find out why they used her grandmother's name though, and in addition, I wasn't able to find out too much about Bridget's upbringing, but there is a lot of information out there about her adult life, so let's fast forward. Bridget married her first husband, Captain Samuel Wasselby, in 1660 in England. One source stated that the couple did have a son together by the name of Benjamin. Benjamin would sadly pass away in infancy. Bridget would immigrate to New England, specifically Boston, Massachusetts, in 1664. She was approximately 32 years old at the time. I had to stop and really think about this for a second. The reason being because in modern times, you can fly across countries and get to a destination on the opposite side of the world relatively fast. Back then, a voyage such as leaving England and coming to the US took months, and it wasn't comfortable whatsoever. Passengers were crammed into the ship like sardines in a can. Not to mention the diseases that were rife at the time, specifically scurvy. It was also very dangerous. This is a ship crossing a major ocean. No one knew if they would make it to their destination or if they would be stuck in the middle of the ocean and possibly die. At this point in time, Bridget was pregnant with her and Samuel's second child, whose name was, as one source writes, Mary. It's unclear if Samuel passed away prior to her immigration or once she was already in the US, or if he was even with her. Unfortunately, Bridget and Samuel's baby would also pass away in infancy when Bridget was residing in Massachusetts. It's been said that Samuel had already passed away prior to their baby also passing away. The cause of death for Samuel was unknown. By 1666, Bridget decided to move to Salem. Now, Bridget was all alone in a new country, but she wouldn't be alone for too long. She would marry Thomas Oliver in 1666. Thomas was a widower and was also from Norwich, England. The couple would call Salem, Massachusetts their home. Thomas and Bridget had one daughter together named Christian, who was born on May 8th, 1667, and Bridget became stepmother to his 3 grown children from a previous marriage. Before we talk about Bridget and Thomas, I did want to briefly go over Thomas's previous wife, Mary Lehman. Now, take this information with a grain of salt because I didn't find too many sources speaking about this. Thomas and Mary were married in Norwich and decided to immigrate to the U.S. As you'll see as we move on with Bridget's life story, Bridget and Mary were somewhat similar. Thomas definitely had a type. Mary was not very well liked. She was religiously independent and didn't really conform to society. She spoke out publicly, and due to this, she would be whipped and tortured as punishment. Thomas would go back to England in 1648, according to one source, and that same source stated the reason for this was unknown. However, in 1649, Mary Lehman would be banished from the colony because of how she carried herself and how outspoken she was. She was forced to go back to England and be with Thomas. What's odd is there's no record of Mary leaving the US or arriving in England. At this point, we can only speculate as to what happened to Mary. Going back to Bridget and Thomas. Unfortunately, Bridget and Thomas didn't have the greatest relationship. They fought a lot, both physically and verbally, and Bridget was known to be out in public with bruises that would be an indication of a physical altercation. It was said that Bridget fought back and that she didn't just accept what her husband was doing to her. They were even brought to court for fighting in 1670. Mary Ropes, who was their neighbor at the time, did testify at this court hearing and stated that Bridget's face was bloody and bruised on many occasions. According to the book Salem Village Witchcraft, a documentary record of local conflict in colonial New England, it said, quote, Mary Ropes, aged about 50 years, deposed that she had several times been called to her neighbor Thomas Oliver's by himself, but mostly by his wife, to hear their complaints one of the other, and they both acknowledged that they had been fighting together. Further, she saw Goodwife Oliver's face at one time bloody and at other times black and blue, and then said Oliver complained that his wife had given him several blows, end quote. The sentencing of this hearing was Bridget and Thomas were fined, and if they didn't pay that fine on time, they would be whipped. 8 years later, in 1678, Bridget was back in court once again for using foul language towards her husband. Now, I know this was back in the late 1600s, but to give you some perspective on how much we have evolved, the foul language that she used were names such as, wait for it, old rogue, and old devil. As someone who does have a potty mouth sometimes, I cannot fathom being a woman back in those times. Foul language was calling someone an old devil. That's just mind-blowing to me. And it's even more mind-blowing that she would have to go to court for using foul language to begin with. Anyway, the two of them were sentenced to stand back to back in the public marketplace unless they paid a fine. With that said, Thomas's daughter actually paid for his fine, but wouldn't pay the fine for Bridget, which meant Bridget had to stand in the public market by herself with a paper that was put on her forehead that said what her offense was. While Bridget stood in the public market for the world to see, she was gagged as well. I think it's safe to say that Thomas's daughter was not a huge fan of Bridget, just like the majority of people. In 1679, Thomas Oliver would pass away for reasons that are unknown. According to one source, he was about 30, maybe more years older than Bridget, so it could have just been his time. Although, as you'll see in a little bit, not everyone was convinced that Thomas died of causes that weren't involving Bridget. After Thomas died, Bridget would inherit his estate. This included a house, 10 acres of land, a variety of household goods, and 2 pigs. Thomas's 2 sons from his previous marriage, and then his and Bridget's daughter Christian, only received 20 shillings each. 3 months later, Bridget was being accused of bewitching Thomas to death by her stepchildren. Due to lack of evidence, the accusations didn't end up going to trial, and there was speculation that the stepchildren were just trying to get the inheritance, which makes the most sense to me. It said that Thomas also left debt for Bridget, so even though she inherited all of these great things, she would also be responsible for some debt. I only saw that little tidbit of information in one source, so also take that with a grain of salt. Later down the line, this would be brought up when she was accused of stealing things. Bridget was the target of witchcraft accusations for a plethora of things. Not only did people gossip that she had been responsible for the deaths of her first 2 husbands because their causes of death were unknown, but in 1680, John Ingersoll's slave 1 claimed that she had pinched him, stolen eggs, and that she scared the horses. It's wild to think that this was considered witchcraft. In 1681, Bridget would have to sell some of her land, and the judge who knew about this sale and granted it was Judge Hathorne. This name is important to remember for later on. Later, in 1687, she was accused of stealing brass from a local mill owner by the name Thomas Stacy and was in fact arrested this time. She claimed that she didn't steal it, but that she had found it on her property and had no idea how it got there. Was someone trying to set her up? From what I've read and learned about Bridget, she probably wasn't the most liked person due to how she didn't back down. In my opinion, she was an independent woman, a free thinker, and someone who refused to be silenced, no matter what people's opinions were of her. I mean, she didn't even dress like the women of her time. She wore colors while other women wore pretty neutral colors such as brown. God forbid a woman wears a little bit of color. Bridget did state that once she found the brass, she asked her daughter to go into town and find out what it was, because they had no idea that it was brass. She wasn't planning on selling it as Thomas Stacy accused her of. The sources that I was reading stated that there were no surviving records to tell us what the outcome of this trial was. Around 1685, Bridget married her third husband, Edward Bishop. He was a sawyer, and in case you don't know what that is, it's a woodcutter. From what I was reading, it said that around this time, Bridget's history gets a little murky due to historians confusing her with Sarah Bishop. Sarah was also accused of witchcraft and was married to Bridget's stepson, who was also named Edward Bishop. I can definitely see how certain facts about her life could get mixed up. One source states, quote, "As the first person to be executed in the Salem witch trials, Bridget Bishop has received plenty of attention from Salem's historians, amateur and professional. She has served as a paradigm of the executed person as a social deviant, the outsider who falls prey to a community, devouring the eccentric on its margin." This is a version of Salem's story codified in 1867 by Charles Upham, who in his Salem Witchcraft told the story of Bridget Bishop as a singular character not easily described. She kept a house of refreshment for travelers and a shovel board for the entertainment of her guests, and generally seems to have amusements to an extent that exposed her to some scandal. She is described as wearing a black cap and black hat and a red paragon bodice, bordered and looped with different colors. This would appear to have been a rather showy costume for the times. Her freedom was the austerity of Puritan manners, and disregard of conventional decorum in her conversation and conduct brought her into disrepute, and the tongue of gossip was generally loosened against her. Upham had made a mistake. Although he correctly identified Bridget Bishop as a woman who previously had been charged with witchcraft, he conflated two people into one, inaccurately identifying her as living just outside of Salem Village rather than in Salem, the town, where she did live, and of being a rather colorful tavern keeper, which she was not. Upham's mistake was understandable since the confusion as to her identity actually goes back to 1692, and only some brilliant detective work by David L. Green in 1981 brought clarity to the matter. Still, some scholars have continued to make the misidentification. What is known about Bridget Bishop at this time is that she lived in what is now downtown Salem, she operated a tavern, and she owned an apple orchard where she also had chickens. Given what I've already talked about so far, I'm sure you already know how Bridget's story ends. Before we get into that, let's go over a brief overview of the Salem witch trials. Why did these start, and what constituted someone being a witch back in those days? In short, the Salem witch trials were a series of hearings and prosecutions of men and women who were accused of witchcraft in Massachusetts between February 1692 and May 1693. More than 200 people were accused, 30 were found guilty, 19 were executed by hanging, 1 was pressed to death, and some died in jail. It all began with a group of young girls who claimed to be possessed by the devil and accused several local women of witchcraft. The Salem witch trials are the epitome of mass hysteria. If we rewind to 14th century Europe, that's actually when believing in the supernatural and the devil was emerging. Back then, many Christians and those from other religions believed that the devil could give certain people who were known as witches the power to hurt other people. Due to this, a witchcraft craze, as one article called it, happened throughout Europe in the 1300s into the 1600s. Something I didn't know is that when the witchcraft craze was kind of dying down is when it would pick up again in Salem. During the late 1600s, there were a lot of bad things going on which could have caused this mass hysteria. They were feeling the effects of the British war with France in the American colonies. In 1689, there was a recent smallpox epidemic, and there were fears of being attacked by Native American tribes near Salem. One source stated that accusations made against who they believed to be witches was fueled by the residents' suspicions of and resentment towards neighbors and fear of outsiders. Something I found out that I don't remember learning in school was when people would say they were bewitched, this was actually due to fungus ergot, which is found in rye, wheat, and other cereals. There was a study done, and the toxicologist said this fungus can cause symptoms of delusions, vomiting, and muscle spasms. Speaking of those symptoms, in January 1692, a 9-year-old by the name Elizabeth Parris and an 11-year-old named Abigail Williams started having fits. These fits included violent contortions and uncontrollable outbursts of screaming. These two girls were diagnosed with bewitchment, and more young girls started having similar symptoms. With all of this going on, not too long after the diagnoses, in late February, Tituba, who was a Caribbean slave, was arrested along with 2 other women, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. They were accused of bewitching these young girls. Both Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne pled not guilty. Tituba, on the other hand, confessed. She said, quote, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him," end quote. Tituba talked about images of black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and a black man who wanted her to sign his book. She stated that she signed the book and that there were more witches looking to destroy the Puritans. More women were accused of being witches, including Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse. The first conviction was Bridget Bishop, who would be executed, and then 5 more people were hanged in July, 5 in August, and 8 more in September. 7 accused witches died in jail, and Giles Corey, who was 71, was pressed to death by stones after he refused to enter a plea at his arraignment. After Bridget's execution, Minister Cotton Mather wrote a letter to the court asking for them to stop allowing spectral evidence. If you don't know what that is, it's when a witness testified using dreams and visions rather than actual hard evidence. The court ignored his request. Increase Mather, who was Cotton Mather's son and then president of Harvard, denounced the use of spectral evidence. Governor Phipps did hear Mather's plea and prohibited further arrests along with releasing many accused witches. With the governor not allowing spectral evidence, it only condemned 3 out of 56 defendants, one source states. Governor Phipps pardoned all of the people accused of witchcraft that were in prison by May 1693. It is so incredibly horrible what happened to these people, all because of mass hysteria and a possible fungus. As we'll go over shortly, it took so long, over 200 years, for the victims to be acknowledged and publicly apologized to by Massachusetts legislature. On April 16, 1692, Bridget Bishop and Mary Warren were accused of witchcraft, and 2 days later, complaints were also filed against Giles Corey and Abigail Hobbs. On April 18, 1692, Bridget Bishop was arrested on charges of witchcraft at the home she inherited from Thomas Oliver, which in present day is Washington Street in Salem town. I do have to add that I have seen other sources state April 19th, 1692 was a day that Bridget was arrested. Regardless, the people who accused her were Mercy Lewis, Abigail Williams, Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott, and Ann Putnam Jr. The following day, on April 19th, 1692, Bridget would be examined by Judge John Hathorne and Judge Jonathan Corwin. Judge Hathorne cut right to the chase and brought up her prior accusations of witchcraft. In my opinion, this judge was kind of an a-hole because while he was questioning Bridget, she kept saying she wasn't a witch, and then the judge said, quote, "How do you know then that you are not a witch?" end quote. Bridget wasn't sure what he meant by that, and he followed this with, quote, "How can you know you are no witch and yet not know what a witch is?" end quote. Bridget, being the badass that she was, didn't back down and stated, quote, "I am clear. If I were any such person, you should know it," end quote. She continued to say she was innocent and wasn't a witch. I don't think that her reputation or the prior accusations against her helped at all in this situation because that very same day she was indicted on 5 separate charges of witchcraft. Not to mention the young girls Elizabeth and Abigail, who were diagnosed with bewitchment, kept convulsing, and this also added to the evidence, or in my opinion, lack thereof, to indict Bridget. Bridget was also accused of trying to get these young girls to sign the devil's book. It's said that the amount of evidence against Bridget was overwhelming. Following this day, over the next few months, more than 10 witnesses would testify against Bridget and how she bewitched their families and their animals. According to one man by the name John Louder, 8 years prior, he was staying with Bridget's neighbor, John Gedney. John Gedney would often get frustrated with Bridget and tell her not to let her chickens walk onto his apple orchard. After these incidents, John Louder claimed that Bridget's spirit attacked him. He claimed that she had threatened him and sent black pigs and a talking deformed monkey to torment him. Samuel Gray testified that Bridget bewitched his child to death 14 years prior and that her spirit appeared in his house one night. Another witness, Susanna Sheldon, testified that she saw the spirit of Thomas Green's twin boys who told her that Bridget Bishop had bewitched them to death. Susanna also stated that Bridget's spirit told her she had killed 4 women, 2 of them were the Fosters' wives. Samuel and Sarah Shudock stated that Bridget asked them to dye a small piece of lace that, in their opinion, could only be used for a poppet, which is a type of doll that at the time was believed to be used for witchcraft. They said that Bridget bewitched their oldest child and physically attacked the child in person. John Bly and his wife Rebecca testified that Bridget sold them a bewitched pig. John Bly and his son William Bly said that they were hired to do some construction on Bridget's home and they found poppets hidden in the walls of her cellar. Which is interesting given that Bridget was not residing in this house when it was built. Thomas Oliver's first wife, Mary, was. As we know from speaking about her earlier, she wasn't exactly well liked by the community and did her own thing, so to speak. Maybe she was into witchcraft, that we really don't know. But the fact still stands that Bridget was not there when the house was built. She might not have even known that the poppets were in the walls. On June 2nd at around 10 a.m., Bridget Bishop, Elizabeth Proctor, Rebecca Nurse, Alice Parker, Susanna Martin, and Sarah Good were examined by 9 local women and a doctor. The examiners reported finding unnatural growths in strange places. After 6 hours, Bridget Bishop and Elizabeth Proctor were clear of any witch marks, and as for the other women, the unusual growths were just dry skin. Bridget's trial only lasted 1 day. On June 8, 1692, she was found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to death. On Friday, June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop would be executed by hanging at Proctor's Ledge in Salem. Sheriff George Corwin was the person who escorted Bridget to her death. Of course, a crowd gathered to watch Bridget Bishop, an innocent woman of the crime set against her, die. Because she was convicted of being a witch, she wasn't allowed to be buried in consecrated ground, so she would be buried right where she was executed. No headstone, no final resting place that wasn't associated with where she was, in my opinion, murdered. I say that because she was innocent, and I do believe she was an easy target. Bridget had a reputation in her community, and it wasn't a good one. This was the epitome of, dare I say, a witch hunt. One source stated that there was more to gain with the other accused of the witch trials. There would be things such as political gain, but with Bridget, no one would gain anything except for silencing a very outspoken woman. While Bridget Bishop wasn't the first to be accused of being a witch, she was the first to be executed during the Salem witch trials. If we fast forward to 1711, Massachusetts passed a bill clearing the names of some of the accused and granted restitution for their families. Bridget's family, amongst others, did not accept the restitution and didn't accept to be named in the bill, which means their names were not cleared. Over 200 years later, the Massachusetts legislature officially apologized for the Salem witch trials and cleared the names of, quote, one Anne Peduiter and certain other persons, end quote, but sadly failed to mention the names of the remaining victims. To some, this might seem minor, but these people were accused of being witches and were executed. They deserve to have their names said out loud, even if they aren't physically here. In 1992, there was a Salem Witch Trials Memorial built, and then in 2001, Massachusetts legislature did the right thing and amended the apology from 1957. 2001 marks the year that the remaining victims had their names cleared. Those victims were Bridget Bishop, Susanna Martin, Alice Parker, Wilmot Red, and Margaret Scott. Another thing I wanted to mention was Bridget's daughter, Christian. According to historian Marilyn Roach, Christian married a man named Thomas Mason. The two had one daughter named Susanna, who was born in 1687. Christian sadly died in late 1693. Bridget Bishop's descendants, through Christian Oliver Mason, still live in New England today. Bridget's tavern, the Bishop House, is still standing as well. In my opinion, I think Bridget was being silenced. She was not quiet by any means. Bridget Bishop did not fit into what society believed a woman should be. A woman was to be reserved and pretty much not have a mind of her own. I mean, for crying out loud, she was brought to court for using foul language and calling her husband an old devil. Back then, a woman was to do exactly as she was told. Bridget didn't do that. She spoke her mind and dressed how she wanted to. She was the type of woman men feared, and maybe even the type of woman some women wanted to be but were too afraid. She was intimidating and unapologetically herself. As they say, Bridget Bishop was a singular character, not easily described.